Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth lecture of the student lecture series. My name is Brenda Vasquez. I'm one of the thesis coordinators of the series. Tonight, we are excited to be joined by Brenda Zhang. Zhang is a designer, artist, organizer, and educator based in Tongva land in Los Angeles, California. They are a founding member of Space Industries and an organizer with the Design as Protest Collective and Dark Matter University. In their practice, they are interested in how disciplinary tools of architecture can be used to imagine futures beyond settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and cisheteropatriarchy. In particular, they investigate hybrid spaces, domestic and industrial, urban and hinterland, familiar and planetary, and as found conditions of the Capitalocene and potential sites for new understandings of place. Zhang is currently an adjunct professor at the California College of Arts and a lecturer at the University of Michigan and the University of Buffalo. She has exhibited paintings at the One Archives at USC Libraries and was in residence at the Gray Areas Foundation Experiential Space Research Lab. As a design professional, they have worked with contractors in Philadelphia, architects and nonprofits in San Francisco, and artists in Los Angeles. Please join me in welcoming Brenda Zhang.
Thank you so much, Brandy. All right, let me get set up. All right. Hello to everyone. My name is Bees, and I'm so happy to be sharing time and space with you today. Thank you to Brandy, Mauricio, Dove, and others on the Student Lecture Series Committee for creating the space for this conversation. And thank you to all of you for coming together virtually with us in this ongoing crisis within crisis within crisis moment. I hope you are all taking care. I'm speaking with you from Tovangar, the unceded traditional lands of the Tongva peoples who have lived and continue to live here in relationship with their homeland. I live in occupied Tovangar as an uninvited immigrant settler and acknowledge that beyond statements of recognition, I and all non-native settlers must commit to ongoing efforts toward decolonization and indigenous sovereignty. A true pandemic blessing for me has been the opportunity and privilege of working with 3 incredible groups of undergraduate and graduate architecture students remotely this semester. My students at California College of the Arts, University at Buffalo, and University of Michigan are ambitious, thoughtful, kind, generous, talented. It is an honor to be learning with them and now with you while I'm speaking to all who have made time and space to listen, it is students that I'm actually holding central to my reflections today. In particular, learning alongside students and my brilliant co-instructors, Kevin Moultrie-Day and A.L. Hu, has given me much opportunity to reflect on architectural practice and what it is that we even mean by architectural practice, a word that comes from the Greek for of or pertaining to action, and the Latin to perform or carry out action. And I'll come back to this in a minute. But first, when we show up to architecture, what are we asked to leave at the door? As students, as workers, as teachers, as caretakers, as siblings, as survivors. Recognizing that our discipline, like others in the Western tradition, are both imagined and therefore porous spaces that do not actually exist, separate from our society and world, and is directly descended from Western imperialism. The exclusion of our identities, experiences, stories, visions, hopes, and knowledges is felt deeply by us, that is, the majority of the world, as harm, alienation, isolation, and structural violence. It is also entirely architecture's loss when this discipline silences, erases, and forces our exits through micro and macro aggressions, rooted in systems and histories of oppression. As students, my generation in the United States was sold an individualistic, exceptionalist, capitalist, and racist narrative that we could be anything when we grew up, regardless of our identities, and that it was our fault if we could not. Instead, I wish I had been taught sooner what the great Toni Morrison teaches us about our responsibility, that if we are free, we need to free somebody else. As a queer, non-binary femme Chinese-diasporic organizer whose practice includes architecture, I'm not here to convince anybody to participate in or practice in the discipline of architecture. The burden is on the discipline to convince us that its practice is relevant to our practices of dreaming, of surviving, of communal care, of coalition building, of future imagining, and collective liberation. When those in the discipline are silent, and when they fail to take action against injustice, we say they are complicit. So as we build towards justice, what can we actually count as architectural practice, that which pertains to action, if so much of what we see in contemporary architectural practice consists primarily of inaction? And now I'm assuming that everyone on the call is on some level interested in cultivating a practice of architecture. Me too. So the idea here is that we must contribute to movements for collective liberation from whichever identities we hold and whichever positions we find ourselves in. It takes all of us to disrupt and dismantle white supremacy, racial capitalism, settler colonialism, Western imperialism, cisheteropatriarchy, ableism, and all systems of oppression, especially from the vantage point of an elitist, white-collar discipline like ours. So what does that practice look like? Well, in any conversation about cultivating anti-racist practices in architecture, we are indebted to Audre Lorde for this and so many other insights and contributions. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. In our limited time, however, I'd like to focus on another quotation later in the same 1984 text. This is an old and primary tool of all oppressors to keep the oppressed occupied with the master's concerns. Now, we often hear Lorde invoked as a reason to discredit and abandon the disciplinary tools that we've been taught in Western architecture. And I've been mulling this over for some time to the following reflections. One, or first, perhaps the master's tools did not belong to the master in the first place. Nearly 1,000 years ago, East Asian artists were drawing and painting in parallel projection, as seen in this over 5-meter-long scroll painting by Zhang Zheduan, titled Qingming Shanghe Tu, or Along the River during the Qingming Festival. I was taught this by my Chinese diasporic family, but not in either Western art school nor Western architecture school. As another example, Fred Wilson composed this installation titled Cabinet Making 1820 to 1960 as part of his seminal 1992 exhibit, Mining the Museum. A series of antique Victorian chairs is juxtaposed with the whipping post. In doing so, Wilson confronts the historical erasure that might suggest to us that these chairs, for instance, are solely of the oppressor. Instead, it's clear that most were the production of skilled craftspeople who were trafficked and enslaved. The tools may have been claimed by the enslaving class, but it is not so clear that the product, the labor, and even the tools then can truly belong to them as more than a claim. And we know this about the histories of innovation of quote unquote new tools in art, architecture, and visual language, that these quote unquote discoveries of new techniques and styles are deeply entrenched in the histories of colonization and empire, and are in many ways simply just what was and is extracted by colonial and imperial states for consumption. Second, perhaps the master's tools are admissible and even more powerful if we choose to disentangle the master's concerns and instead to uplift our own. So for our consideration, I'll first focus on my individual use and intentional misuse of disciplinary tools in service of my concerns. This looks like visual representation and in particular architectural representation, and then finish by discussing disciplinary tools in service of communal concerns. And this looks primarily like organizing work. Individual concerns showing up as an extreme attachment to certain objects. Portraits of objects as deferred statements. The cone that says, pay attention, even after it's knocked over. A chair as a presence or an absence. Parallel projection on vertical canvases evoking Chinese hanging scrolls. A misuse of canvas and wood to support life rather than supporting painted surface. Painting as a trellis. Lamps as domestic characters plugged into violent resource extraction. And in a larger art installation titled Light Bulb, Little Bomb, after the Spanish bombilla, which suggests both meanings in Picasso's Guernica. Here, live wires of assemblage lamps drawing mountaintop removal coal mining sites in topography onto the walls. The domestic and the planetary, illumination and destruction at the same time, light bulb, little bomb, literalizing our intimate relationship between the private, dreamlike lamp and the nightmarish sources with which we power them. Paint on a different kind of surface, a color study in which the personal is the political. Proximity to whiteness makes you your own backstabber. In another project that straddles art and architecture, here an apparatus for the body that literalizes the act of making space for another body, created in collaboration with another architectural designer, Amy Louie. We can see comfort, discomfort, power and agency given by the wearer, but also taken away by temporary occupying bodies. Who makes space? Who takes space? And how do these processes happen? In imagining a prosthetic that allows one body to literally make space for another, we also make visible the vulnerability of such a body in relation with other unfamiliar bodies. And we recommend further testing in more locations. And perhaps we also recommend more overuse of orthographic projection in service of making jokes. Another misuse here of the sectional drawing, in which sectional cuts are generated through free-handed curves rather than planes, drawn to isolate unexpected fragments of models for closer examination, purpose unknown. In my design, teaching, and research practices, I ask how disciplinary tools of architecture can be used for building new social and physical constructions of place. In Western society, we strive to represent spaces that interest us and fail, often dangerously, to represent those that do not. Put another way, Western society is very good at using tools of representation to illustrate the world, but only through the lens of its own concerns. So here we have conventional ways of seeing and knowing the freeway, privileging vehicular access, softening historical trauma. Freeways are almost ubiquitously represented by flattening their lanes to approximate other roads, rather than to acknowledge what they are, which is concrete monoliths that have been used as tools of a settler colonial state to displace communities that it considers disposable in service of capital and war. Here, other ways of seeing and knowing the freeway by applying a conventional blanket 4 foot above finished floor horizontal section to the 580-880 interchange in Oakland, California, to reveal entire city blocks of poché, and by choosing to see what has been torn from the urban fabric. Seeing the freeway differently by using the same architectural tools to make visible the violence of freeway infrastructure at a human scale, from left to right, the on-ramp at 35th and West, the underpass near MacArthur BART, the hill by the Walgreens, the colonnade, by Eli's. What stories can we tell just by shifting the bounding boxes, the frames themselves? How might we rescript the Western architectural canon, full of, as noted, tools that don't even necessarily belong to it exclusively, to reveal new stories, for instance, of what the extents are of an airport's dominion after our bodies have undergone biopolitical screening? What might we learn from looking at what we as a public cannot see? This is an automatically generated map of crowdsourced images and street views on Google, with the Los Angeles International Airport and the El Segundo Chevron refinery inscrutable to the public eye. What happens when we use an as-built as a disciplinary tool of architecture to see decay and cultural construction rather than as an implement of capitalism? Allow to hang loose, no need to change filters. Allow for material failure. Optional stacking, reason unimportant. Allow overgrowth, do not maintain. Construction documentation with new concerns, new directives. By encountering these unconventional places as-built, with found conditions to be surveyed and verified in field, we can hone in on qualities of place that can be recorded through architectural tools, but often are overlooked in conventional academic and professional practice. A few more as-builts, using architecture to tell other stories of seemingly familiar places. So, the on-ramp to the 580 freeway again in Oakland, the Stones oil rig, operated by Shell in the US Gulf of Mexico, and currently the deepest deep sea oil and gas project in the world, and the planet Earth as a planned section elevation. Employing uniquely architectural tools of representation, for instance, section cuts, break lines, orthographic projection, material coding, cross-referencing, scale, to make visible qualities, limits, and potentials of what we once considered to be familiar space. And to recognize that the oil rig in particular was such a challenge to draw, not really because of scale, which architects are good at handling, but because of the intentional obscuration by fossil fuel industries to not allow us as the public to understand what these structures look like or how big they really are. So as you might notice, beginning from when I was an architectural student myself, I became very preoccupied with two words, two cultural ideas that we don't use much in architecture: home and elsewhere. Home, while of course primarily used to describe a place of domestic habitation, is also referring generally to a familiar or usual setting. So home base, home page, home court, even home button. As a counterpoint, elsewhere shifts our attention in or to another place, not here, away. I became drawn specifically to spaces where elsewhere and home seemed to collide, where it was obvious that neither word fit what was going on. Much of my work since then remains situated both in the literal spaces of elsewhere and home, so landfills, houses, wilderness, base camps, wastelands, hometowns, and in their socially constructed space. So the value embedded narratives that determine whether something belongs and to whom. And since we construct both narratives through principles of exclusion, elsewhere is a lot closer to home than we say. So the question I began to ask was, how can we use architectural tools not in service to capitalist development, but to understand critical challenges and realities of our time? And put another way, elsewhere or else where when we search for a place like home? How does architecture see? How could we see differently? And how do we build what we've now seen differently? For this next project, we're looking at 4 sets of drawings and models, utilizing techniques of architectural representation and construction to ask questions about 4 sites of home and elsewhere in the San Francisco Bay Area, each selected because of varying conditions of adjacency and collision between loaded ideas of place. First, Refinery Beach, Beach Refinery, which is the Chevron Refinery and adjacent shoreline, Point Melati Beach Park in Richmond, California. Second, Wetland Campus, Campus Wetland, which is the Facebook headquarters designed by Frank Gehry and the adjacent salt flats in Menlo Park. Third, Landfill Farm, Farm Landfill, which is the Ox Mountain Sanitary Landfill and adjacent agricultural fields in Half Moon Bay. And fourth, Freeway Town, Town Freeway, which is that 980-580 freeway exchange. Speaking of extreme attachments to certain objects and the adjacent neighborhoods in Oakland. I'm also going to have to pause for 5 seconds because you may have already heard there's a cat scratching at my door that I have to let in. The dangers of lecturing from home. Please excuse that. So in each site, a hybridized landscape between domestic and industrial, urban and hinterland, and natural and built is investigated as both found conditions of the Anthropocene, or what we might actually call the Capitalocene, and as potential sites for new understandings of place. And because I did this project as a graduate architecture student, it was not so much dreaming as it was actually sort of an architectural fever dream. Taken together, these architectural products represent a near future, forthcoming present Bay Area in which claims to spaces made by opposing places have reached deadlock. Everyone is staying. In this way, the project intentionally re-scripts existing hierarchies and patterns of power in order to imagine alternatives of any kind, using the master's tools without the master's playbook. And in entertaining these fictionalized outcomes, the project hoped to create new representations of what is lost and what remains, and to subvert assumptions about what's possible and of what's inevitable. These assumptions that become further ingrained within us with each reiteration of displacement. The first set of tools used are analytical drawings and models that apply uniquely architectural strategies to seemingly non-architectural qualities of homes and elsewheres in search of their boundaries, if boundaries exist. This is based on analyses of existing conditions of zoning, air and light, cultural narratives, and programmatic requirements, as well as formal strategies of representation, design, and construction. The research and design work developed not only through representational tools and construction assemblies of architecture, but also close readings of site through historical lenses of how these disciplines reflect social and cultural constructions of places back to us. The second set of tools responds to the first, using architectural design as a means to bring home and elsewhere together. The drawings and models establish basic formal strategies such as lofting, offsetting, punching through, terracing, observed from the existing compositions, the found conditions of the landscape and built forms. And it does this to negotiate and visualize how these resulting spaces could be occupied, by the overlapping programs of elsewhere and home in the form of new as-builts. Just as as-builts and surveys conventionally inform the transition between old and new constructions, the intention was to reveal possible transitions between old and new ideas of place. So this starts to get at what architects could do with our existing skill sets just by shifting our attention elsewhere. The sites shown here and the real concerns that they represent, climate change, gentrification and displacement, racial and socioeconomic stratification, undeniably exist. But because of the ways we as Western society draw thick boundaries around them and between them, and the way that we as architects in the Western tradition work within bounding boxes, they resist architectural focus to our detriment. And just to use one example, you can see at a glance that by how these hybrid landscapes are represented conventionally, in this case in photographs, but you'll see this in drawings as well, you would have no idea that these two spaces had an adjacency at all. And as Richmond, California residents fighting environmental injustice can attest, this is a harrowing and dangerous oversight with extreme harms done to communities, neighborhoods, and ecosystems. And finally, a note on naming as a tool. In speculating on their collision, do we understand a, quote, refinery beach to be a sandy shore with oil production on it? Or a beach refinery, a space where beaches can slowly become more beach? Does the landfill farm cultivate landfills for us to harvest in the fall? Or is it a farm landfill, a place where we've discarded the farms we don't want anymore? Is the freeway town a town full to the brim with freeways? Or is the town freeway the freeway that belongs to all of us? It may be worth mentioning too that with this project in particular, I've been accused of secretly doing a landscape architecture project and not an architecture project, or a visual art project and not an architecture project. Or, and this one is perhaps the most fair, a performance art project and not an architecture project. My criteria for models in this case, in an effort to push what that tool, the architectural model, can be to the limits of its usefulness, was only to make them the scale at which they can be huggable. These 1/4 inch to a foot models had an incredible day at Point Reyes, by the way, and so did I. So I'm partially joking when I use the word accuse, but if we know that design disciplines so easily and seemingly readily become conduits of systems of oppression, there should not be bounds on the explorations we make to understand how exactly these tools work and for whom. The one more quick project using play to defamiliarize. White representation is a current project of mine that uses cutouts and their subsequent use as unlikely sites within architectural production to subvert whiteness and reveal white supremacy. Over the years, we've seen folks in our discipline chip away at the lack of representation for Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian folks. Many incredible open source websites have emerged to provide free cutouts of Black folks, such as on Black Image, Latinx folks, such as Escala Latina, the elderly, such as Elderly Entourage, and generally underrepresented and marginalized identities, so non-Scandinavia and others, as a form of rectifying representation of identities within architecture. But in acknowledging that existing cutouts that we have of white people in actuality depict only a myth of a neutral, innocent white person, we might make an interesting and somewhat tongue-in-cheek statement in reverse, that real white people are much more complex as individuals. So white supremacists and white abolitionists are both erased by myths of white racial innocence. And perhaps white representation matters as well. As a note, the project is satirical and the images are intended for educational use only and are not licensed for commercial use of any kind. How might an open source collection of cutouts as a tool of architectural representation rectify this dearth of white representation? And which white representations would we identify as currently missing? How can naming, again, be used as a subversive tool? For instance, white felons charged with unlawful use of weaponry in comparison with existing titles of cutouts, such as Women Walking with Dog. And how can the white supremacy of architects like Philip Johnson, inextricable from their works, be visually rendered using the lowly cutout figure? So while the representation of people outside of US and Eurocentrism does indeed matter more, and calls to decenter whiteness are timely and pertinent, the project is just interested in using these sites of image production and the ongoing conversations around representations of race, not just to skewer the myth of white racial innocence and neutrality, but also to draw connections between white supremacist behaviors and white supremacy reified in architecture. So particularly as white supremacy inflicts harm upon all of us, including those who are themselves racialized as white, these inquiries use play as an access point and proof of concept for interrogating each of the tools that we use as architects towards an anti-racist practice. Then, to speak about those master's tools that can be deployed in a community context with our concerns in mind. On a collective level, how do we co-create and use our positions and platforms creatively and critically? Firstly, to state what should be obvious. If we have large format plotters, 3D printers, laser cutters, shop access, then we can provide community work in solidarity with movement building and with organizers and demonstrators who need flyers, posters, banners, and shields. If we have a tape measure, a clipboard, paper, and a pencil, we can provide community work to Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian-owned businesses who may not have the tools to make their physical space COVID compliant, or who may have sustained physical damage and rioting incited by the police state. Or to Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian folks who need general support navigating austere and historically racist permitting and zoning processes. If we have graphic design skills, project management skills, diagramming, programming, analysis, mapping skills, we can be in service to our communities and our concerns with any of these tools at our disposal. Together with my design collective Space Industries, which is comprised of Kevin Moultrie-Day, Celeste Martore, Jason Campbell, and me, we've written and spoken on racial injustice in architecture for numerous publications and conferences. But as well, not pictured here for confidentiality, one of our most meaningful projects together was pro bono work we did for a San Francisco-based racial justice nonprofit undergoing an eviction process in the Tenderloin. We supported them with walkthroughs, as-built, and schematic design drawings as they navigated their search for a new office home. And last June, we created the Anti-Racism Design Resources document as a tool in service of and in solidarity with the movement for Black lives. It's a live document that's been updated near daily and has been contributed to and amplified by hundreds, if not thousands, of folks in our disciplines and in these movements. Now, as part of the Design as Protest Collective, we continue to compile those events and opportunities and publish them on Instagram at Design as Protest as a weekly roundup. So as a core organizer with the Design as Protest Collective, a Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian-led collective of anti-racist designers, we're using design action, research, storytelling, mutual aid, and field organizing to demand design justice and challenge the power structures that use architecture and design as tools of oppression. And something that's been modeled for me by the incredible folks as in the collective is that, is how deeply communal and self-care are central to this collective work, right? So imagining and building futures requires dismantling and unlearning toxic and exploitative cultures today. And as an organizer with Dark Matter University, which is a democratic network of Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian architectural workers, I'm co-teaching this semester with an incredible team our inaugural seminar titled Foundations of Design Justice, which we're offering across 4 schools. We collaboratively created and co-authored this class to challenge hegemonic pedagogies, canons, and epistemologies drawn from paradigms of white domination, and to instead model new forms of knowledge production, and new forms of resource distribution between institutions. We often say in DAP that if everyone does a little, no one does a lot. And there are so many powerful and meaningful actions and campaigns. We could have a whole entire other lecture about all the stuff, all the different actions and campaigns that folks are up to in DAP. But I wanted to highlight specifically a tool developed and co-authored by a phenomenal, inspiring team of DAP organizers called the Anti-Racist Design Justice Index. The ARDJI is a living tool for all areas of design fields in the public realm. The goal of the index is to achieve liberation within design institutions by holding them accountable specifically to their own anti-racist commitments, by providing a visual way to track accountability and also providing resources for guiding concrete actions. The 2 axes used, as you can see, are action on the one hand, ranging from the bare minimum acknowledgements to accountability, representation, reparations, accessibility, and influence. And the other axis being direction, ranging from, again, the bare minimum of equality to equity to justice and finally liberation. The tool is written for those committed to taking action. So all of us, architects, landscape architects, designers, planners, policymakers, activists, students who work in professional practices, nonprofit and for-profit organizations, academic institutions, and local governments. We all come to this work with our own biases and positionalities, and the tool empowers us to map out how all of this is expressed and thus can be changed. And as a note, these establishments are the initial focus of where we work, but in the coming iterations, we need to and are actively building bridges with grassroots organizers who are working outside of these establishments as well, right? Whose liberation work intersects deeply with ours. As a collective, we've begun to facilitate workshops and presentations specifically on the Anti-Racist Design Justice Index, and I am more than happy to connect anyone interested today to our efforts. That said, as an educator myself, I took the liberty of choosing just a handful of examples from the academic institutions matrix to share with you today. So, pay students for participating in the institution's anti-racist work. Pay them. Don't hold events without BIPOC representation. Provide classes and lectures in languages that reflect the student body. When we teach the history of systemic racism in our context, teach as well the role that our institution has played in that history. Dismantle the grade system as the only measure of success. Expand studio project timelines based on communities' needs, not semesters. Provide free education for Indigenous communities whose land the university occupies. It's awe-inspiring to bear witness to the proliferation of new organizing by students, staff, faculty, alums, and community members in academic spaces this past year. Thanks to all of your efforts and these tools developed through collective practice, centering our community's concerns, there are no longer any excuses for any institution to not know where to start. And I just wanted to make an additional note here as a former student who was also an organizer. When I entered the discipline of architecture, I was told implicitly and explicitly that things that I did, quote unquote, outside of architecture did not matter and were not relevant to show on a CV. I might as well delete everything that came before and start over, is what I was advised. Although there have always been BBIA plus communities, LGBTQIA plus communities, disabled and or neurodivergent, migrant and or undocumented communities within the realms of building, designing, and making spaces into places, there is a long way to go. And still many in our discipline choose inaction as their practice. To many in the discipline, this is what my practice looks like. And this is what my practice actually is. And I'm so proud of what my practice was as a graduate architecture student, fighting with other students to advocate for the classmates that we were missing due to the removal of a diversity fellowship, which we successfully then had reinstated. To protect students against the sexual misconduct of tenured faculty who were being protected because of their tenure status. To respond to the collective grief, anger, and fear in the wake of the 2016 presidential election. And to make good fun of the classic diversity photo ops. So back to the question of practice. Architectural practice allows us to operate as both visualizers of space, real and imagined, and as movers of capital, labor, material, and embodied energy. We draw the same lines with little to no accountability for what those lines might mean across disciplines or cultures or species or scales. However, we're also uniquely positioned to take action. Writing on use, theorist Sara Ahmed explores the banality of power reproducing itself. In our discipline, this shows up in the minutiae, the details and specifications pulled from one project to the next, as well as in the hegemonic narratives that we maintain about place, about who designs it and who benefits from it. in order to dismantle systems of oppression, especially in architecture. My challenge to myself and to all of us is to actually disentangle our hangups about tools and concerns, because we need all tools at our disposal to achieve the futures we deserve. A tool of oppression can be a tool of liberation when wielded in different hands. And as I am still personally processing the legacies of white sexual imperialism, racialized misogyny and transmisogyny, class warfare, anti-Black white supremacy, and militant nationalism that created and perpetuated the violence we saw last month that murdered 6 Asian women in Atlanta, and that continue to deny justice for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many other lost loved ones across time and space. I am profoundly grateful for the Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian, trans, queer, disabled, migrant, working class leaders and ancestors that fought to open the door and keep the door open for me and for you. And I urge all of us who have ever been asked to leave part of ourselves at the door to deeply invest in ourselves and each other, to cultivate practices that use architecture as a tool set to tell other stories, to tell historically othered stories, to tell our stories, and to practice telling our stories in solidarity together. And so for me to tell just one more story, if that's all right. In the last part of my reflections, I wanted to bring you with me on a walk along the 51-mile-long Los Angeles River near where I live. Last one. Thank you for coming with me on that. And now, I don't dream of labor. We may need to say we do in order to survive. We say a lot of things and do a lot of things as coping mechanisms, as tactics for survival. I honor this about myself and about you and about our ancestors. But even as my ancestors labored, I truthfully don't think that they dreamed of labor either. It is okay to dream. It's great to dream. It's critical that we dream. And it is also okay to be disappointed when we are told implicitly or explicitly that our dreams don't matter. As an architecture student, I was often and sometimes primarily disappointed. It is disappointing to enter a discipline, to trust institutions that lead us to believe that they have our best intentions at heart, or that they have something of use to offer us, and to find that they made no space for our dreams or for us. It is disappointing to dream of architecture as a skill set, as a practice that might liberate us, and to be repeatedly beaten over the head with models of practice that further perpetuate harm. It is disappointing to be asked to overwork as a student and be told that this toxic work culture, full with coercion and exploitation and gaslighting, is only what's in store for us as practitioners. It is disappointing to be trained to ignore who we are, to forget the communities we come from, to offload responsibility and accountability to an unknown somebody else. It is disappointing to be given one hoop after another to jump through without guarantee of support of basic foundational needs to be met. I dream of time and space to just be. I dream of feeling the sun on my skin. I dream of safety and autonomy for all my siblings on this earth. As a survivor of sexual violence, I dream of joy and groundedness in my body. As a descendant of Chinese-diasporic immigrant settlers, I dream of breaking cycles of trauma. As a person with bipolar disorder, I dream of expansiveness and care in my everyday. As a queer, non-binary, bisexual femme person, I dream of rest, of laying down armor. When I go to the Los Angeles River, the original life giver of the Tongva peoples, I am dreaming. My body is humming because this place refuses to be its Western construction. The river fed the entire basin that the settler state calls Los Angeles now and was its primary water source until the Los Angeles Aqueduct opened in 1913 and began stealing water from elsewhere, which turned out to be Payapunadu, the Owens Valley. It was channelized by the US Army Corps from 1938 onward in response to the natural consequence and hubris of overbuilding on an ancient floodplain. When I'm at the LA River, I am reminded of stories told to me about scholars' rocks as a child, a Chinese and East Asian tradition of delighting in the transformative power of water to create formal qualities of delicate thinness, openness, perforation, wrinkling. I notice that I look for these qualities in the concrete as it is eroded and transformed by water. I notice that I look for birds' unlikely nests, unlikely homes in the drainage pipes, the pathways to elsewhere. And I look for lost or discarded items, trash thrown away to elsewhere, which turns out to be here. I notice that river and scholars' rock and birds and trash are only seen as commodities within a Western settler colonial worldview. I used to dream about who I could have been if not for racialized misogyny, assimilation and erasure, cis-heterosexism. Now I dream more about who I've yet to become because of who I choose to be in community with, and to what I dedicate the labor I choose or need to do. At a recent panel organized by 3 compassionate, inquisitive, and resourceful graduate students at CCA, my co-panelists and I were asked about the challenges faced by women and non-binary folks, especially those who are non-white in architecture. In listening to the thoughtful questions, I found myself taking a step back to remind us we inherently belong. For all the survival tactics we are indoctrinated or coerced into implementing, the shitty men spreadsheets we make to warn one another, the tireless microaggressions we face, we inherently belong in the practice of making space into place. And so, as so many have taught us, particularly from Black radical and feminist thought and indigenous knowledge traditions, socially constructed disciplines and institutions founded in settler colonialism and white supremacy are a house of cards waiting to fall. For those dependent on the master's house and the master's concerns, that can feel existentially frightening. But there are older, deeper, fuller ways of knowing and being. I don't dream of labor. I dream of a future after abolition and decolonization. And I think we can dare to practice dreaming of and building that future together. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I think we could start with questions, and I think Mauricio had the first one that he wanted to ask you.
Sure, I can read it. Hi, Bees. So thank you so much for your presentation and all your words and thoughts that you put into it and all your efforts. Just want to congratulate you on that. And I wanted to add with a couple of questions. As illustrated in Freeway Town Freeway, your work has imagined ways to detour or reroute the master's tools despite the master's concerns. Recently, we learned that part of the infrastructure bill Biden is proposing includes demolishing some highways cutting through Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Can you lend us your perspective in the way this has been represented and proposed to be carried out? That's question number one. And then I got a couple following ones that can help us just think through. Can you share your vision on reimagining and reusing the road surface in addition or as an alternative to demolishing, and how could it provide resources towards economic and social justice for the communities at stake? And further on, have you tried to propose your ideas to the local political process, and or what resources do you seek or find missing in such a feat?
Thank you, Mauricio. Thank you for those thoughtful questions. And you're catching me because I actually haven't looked super closely at Biden's infrastructure plan yet in terms of the representations, but that is a fascinating, that's a deep dive I need to make. And if there are others on the call who have thoughts, I would love to hear them. I think that's such a provocative question that we should be answering. I think the way to kind of address this group of questions for me is to think, is a question I ask myself and my students a lot, which is like, when we pick up a tool and to use, like, what is that tool really good at? And what is it really not good at? And how do we, and that sort of is the key to some of the questions you pose for me. So, I haven't taken these ideas to municipal or local political processes. And the reason is they're not my audience, and what I use the tools for are not necessarily what are not necessarily tools that I think are very good for local municipal political change. What I think the tools I've been using and showing you today are really good at is for expanding our imaginary, expanding our idea of what is possible. And I think the phrase I used earlier was like subverting the assumptions of what we think are inevitable outcomes, right? To show us that these are not inevitable or that these are constructed and thus can be changed. That's a whole area, I think, of what design disciplines are good at that often, I think, aren't completely given a lot of space in a conversation on racial justice. And it's not that I think more should be made, actually. but that this is a whole, this is the realm that some of my work on representation exists for. I think in terms of like imagining potential ways that freeways can be demolished and removed, however, I actually don't think it's that hard. I don't actually think that it's going to take a lot of imagining, because people have been reappropriating built forms for as long as there have been built forms. We kind of forget this sometimes, probably more so in school than in practice, that the way that we build something almost, it's more inevitable that something is done to modify it or appropriate it. So if you go to any of the freeways that I depicted, people have left their mark on how they can be used as shelters, how they can be used as murals, and so on and so forth. I don't believe there is a necessarily top-down solution. I actually think that what I would imagine and hope for is that communities themselves can determine what happens to the freeway that is cut through their neighborhood. Is that fair?
Thank you. Well, I have some pushbacks, but
Right.
and mostly it's this idea of disciplines not having a place in a community themselves, right? Or in the imagining of a community, such as thinking that these ideas are for the audience, the architecture audience, and not beyond that, right? Because then we're kind of limiting what our imagination as architects, artists who are also people of color and indigenous and Black have to say from within their disciplines and outside, right? Back to the community. So I think these are things that I'm seeing in your work. And that's why I asked the question.
Yeah, maybe I misread your question. I'm saying the audience is not a local politician. Not that the audience is not a community in their context.
Right, and as part of a community, it could propose, right? Or I guess what I'm saying with the last question was, what are we missing, right? What are we missing so that we can make that leap from the discipline to then things that are being proposed to be part of that imagination? Because with the lack of, because you've already done the hard work, right? Which is how do I imagine, a town in a freeway, right? You've already done that. You've represented it. So now I think what I'm asking, or kind of what I wanted to discuss, is how do we imagine then taking that into action, right? Which is what you started with.
Yeah, I hear you. I think, again, there's this line for me. So on the one hand, that was really important for me to base a speculative project like that in what can actually be built, right? So all of my section details were heavily researched in terms of how would you actually have a freeway ramming through a home and have the sound, the acoustic protection, the sound insulation, the structural considerations that could enable that to happen. Absolutely. Yes, anybody can take my architectural drawings and propose it. I think the point that I'm making is I actually don't believe that I personally, as an individual designer working by myself, am asking anybody to accept my individual vision as more than a provocation or a vision. And I think that's a really tough pill for me and other young designers to swallow. Even as I'm saying it out loud, I'm kind of like, oh, like, what am I saying? Am I saying that I'm ineffective? And I kind of think that I'm saying I am. I think there's so much growing understanding, shared understanding that the model of architectural practice where we just want to build, and that's how you establish yourself, and that's how your idea becomes important. And if it's a paper architecture, if it's unbuilt, then you haven't proven your concept. I think that that's really harmful, and it perpetuates a norm that we need to continue building, even if we can't really afford it as a society, even if it causes environmental harm, even if it perpetuates an economic injustice that we need to build to establish ourselves as architects. And my point is that I think that we can speak as architects without those kinds of insecurities and anxieties. And then the work that we do collectively, I have much stronger confidence in saying, let's find a group of us. Let's not ask me, let's find a group of us. And then, I value my own opinion too, certainly, but let's together put our minds together and then come up with a solution for a freeway.
Thank you.
I appreciate those questions though, Mauricio. I hear the what do we do? I'm with you. I'm down to keep talking about these kinds of issues too. And I know that it's not just I'm just one person, again, with one perspective.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your openness too in discussing it, and having more of a conversation rather than like an answer, like a direct yes or no answer.
I think we have a follow-up question. I'm not sure if they want to read it out loud or if they would like to say it.
Is that me?
Yeah, I
Or,
believe so. Yeah.
okay. Well, first and foremost, thanks, BZ. Really thoughtful. Well, I can read my question. To repurpose or to dismantle this dichotomy is something that's been essential to the fight against an imperialist slash capitalist architecture. Spatial violence does not simply go away. What is the temporal power of the anti-racist dialogue, and what are the steps that a young architect or student could do to engage?
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I think that covers so much of the challenges that we face collectively. So I appreciate it. I think that, architecture is such a fun discipline to be in. Art has been as well. That was my first background, because all these words that people use as metaphors are just like our everyday. So even when I hear you say like to repurpose or dismantle, I'm thinking to metaphorically and literally. And I think that is, I think that's again where the thing that we are actually fighting for is self-determination. I feel the tension because I also intuitively want to have someone tell me this is what we do in each of these instances, and we follow that, it's fine. I mean, there are cases where that's possible. I think the work that folks put into the Anti-Racist Design Justice Index is a great example. Like there are tangible actions that you can take, that if everybody took this action, great news. But in terms, I think about like there's this, there's so many examples, for instance, of environmental disasters, that Chernobyl being the big one, but also, there's like an oil, a decommissioned oil rig, I think off the coast of Santa Barbara, that has become like, because it's something for young fish and coral to latch onto, it's become like the central, like new fish nursery that's like repopulating the ecosystem off of the coast. So people are trying to remove the oil rig, but then there's all of these environmentalists who are actually like, wait, stop. Like we need that because now it's brought all this fish back, so there's all of these like record scratch, like tire screeching moments where we're like, what, what's going on? And I think that is where I am so deeply fascinated. I think we all have to be, is where there's no binary. There's just no binary for it. It's actually just both. And you're absolutely right. The spatial violence doesn't go away. There's the, we kind of have to learn, there's no going back. There's only going forward. So in terms of the temporal power of anti-racist dialogue then, and what the steps are for young students and architects, I think it's most empowering for me for myself and talking to young architects to think about the banal, to think about the details. So as I said, like, we'll often like you'll draw the bathroom one way and then you just pull it onto the next project because that's the easy thing to do. But maybe there was a critical, issue, or maybe the material that you spec'd previously is some like ethical issue that we didn't consider. And then now all of a sudden we've replicated it like 100-fold. I think it's the same in terms of our dialogue. So I think even when, something that I feel like folks in DAP have modeled really well for me is, when one of us is like apologizing, saying like, oh, sorry, I didn't get to this because I had this like really real life scenario. And then somebody else will step in and be like, well, that's not really a sorry situation. So maybe take that back, I think it's in the small details and of interrupting, there's all this language emerging about bystander training, about how do you see something and then interrupt it. I think, in the courses that I teach in architecture, there's I check in a lot with my students, and if they say that there's a lot going on, like we move the deadline or we change, like in all of the courses I've taught this semester, we have removed assignments, we have moved deadlines, we've changed the syllabus based on what folks are asking for, you know, and I think that those, obviously those are easier for me to say as a faculty, but I actually do think though, I really needed the students to tell me as well. And that's a risky thing because not all faculty will be receptive, but even, I'll give just one other like banal example. Like even recently I was about to put my students in breakout rooms of 2, and then somebody just like very hesitantly raised their hand and said, or whatever, however you do that in Zoom, and said, actually, I'm so sorry if this is an inconvenience, but can you put us in groups of 3? And I was like, oh, okay, what's that about, right? And the person explained, like, sometimes it's hard to keep the conversation going if it's just 2 people. It's like it takes the pressure off when we're in breakout rooms as students. If there's just another, it's that the dynamic of 3 is better. That was like, my mind was blown that whole day. I was just like, I'm so glad that this person told me this because I have learned today. And such a small detail, but I'm going to be able to apply that elsewhere. So I know that's kind of like, what am I talking about? It's kind of a, again, just banal detail, but I think that is where I feel very empowered and hope to empower others, that these things, we don't have to, again, the top-down mindset is not going to save us. It's, you know, it's all of these small moves that we can do.
Yeah, I think, yeah, totally. I think like, I mean, you can just go on like DZine or something like that, and you'll see people, like the discourse has to shift from like the design of something to the design of our social structures and things like that. I think that's something that needs to happen because you can go on DZine and see people arguing about why someone won the Pulitzer Prize. That's pretty insignificant in like the course of everything else. But there are things that I think are way more important in that dialogue. But yeah, thank you.
Of course, I agree completely. There's more to say to this too, yeah.
I had sort of a follow-up to that question. Have you also taught different modes of representation to students to not only mobilize designers, but they also think how do you mobilize communities? Because I feel like architectural representation, like only we understand it, but in order to mobilize a community and build everything from the ground up or from the bottom up, I guess, it's like we also have to learn a different way of speaking to people and producing images for other people. So I was just curious if you've taught them as well something different than these tools.
Yeah, it's something that I hope, I'm really excited about and hope to be working on and thinking about for the rest of my life. So I appreciate the way you framed this question, Brandy. Thank you. I think that something I think about is like, yes, the barriers to access are so huge. And the fact that like we need, or I actually would argue, say we need so many years of training just to understand and talk to each other in architectural drawing is such a weirdly big barrier that I think is completely surmountable. And I think it does begin with how we teach design. I haven't taught a class, I guess, explicitly on this, but when I'm teaching studio, and in the studio I'm currently teaching at CCA, which has been so fun. Kevin and I explicitly have non-architects coming in all the time. We've brought community experts from the community where our studio is sited. And we try to model as faculty that things that are going on outside of our class are not extracurricular, are part of the class, and we make time for that. That's one of the reasons why we had removed some of the assignments, actually, because there's something going on at CCA that I won't speak about what it is specifically right now, but that we wanted our students to pay attention to that was going on in terms of the institution's role in something larger. And part of that is like having these conversations that I find fascinating and my students might find irritating, but hopefully meaningful, which is like having these conversations where I ask them, like, you know, who's your audience, of course, but like who, you know, like what is this person, this entourage, like this person telling, like what is this piece of furniture saying? I think a lot about Celeste Martori's work actually as a set designer with that too, you know, in terms of like, there are things that are cueing, you know, us and priming us to understand and infer something about from an architectural drawing that we have been letting ourselves off the hook for forever. And when I ask my students to answer these questions, sometimes, you know, they get very indignant, kind of, I think in a hopefully positive way, where they're kind of like, okay, I get it, I get why we're asking these questions, but, you know, like I can feel them sort of being like, maybe normally I wouldn't be asked this, and maybe this is an extra thing. And my response to that is always like, no, like you're always reproducing an assumption, you're always reproducing an idea, you just didn't think about it before and no one asked you to think about it, you know? So even within a typical studio format, just by asking a couple of different questions, I think that every studio could start to have these kinds of dialogues. And that's, again, sort of, I think, going back to the other question, what I mean when I say it's a little bit in the details and in the banal. If everybody just, I could give them my questions, we could publish the questions that I ask my students, and then if every studio professor asked them to their students, we would have thousands of conversations like this happening tomorrow.
Thank you. I think we had one last question about the LA River Revitalization Plan, if you would like to speak on that.
Oh my goodness, there's so much to say about the LA River Revitalization Plan. Wow, there's so much to say. You know, I think what's so striking about it is that 51 miles is huge. It's extreme, even for a metropolitan area like LA, you know, where we're accustomed to driving everywhere. 51 miles spans so many different neighborhoods. The part of the LA River that I showed you is in Northeast LA, but there it looks completely different, of course, up and down the river. And the place where I go for walks is much more affluent. The set designer I mentioned is Celeste Martori, who is on this call, and is incredible. But to the LA River Revitalization Plan again, they try to do. I've been to some of the community meetings. They have tried to do this kit of parts where, you know, they're adding you know, modular kind of pieces of like a bike path, or, you know, an area for like, you know, cultural signage, or an area for you know, adjacent to a park, in order to accommodate the 51 miles. And I honestly would say I would want to, I don't know if I can do like a critique of it justice in the limited time we have, but what I'm always, I can share that what I'm always like wondering and questioning is, you know, we can design all day, and within the lens of the city of LA and the other municipal entities that are in control of the process, you know, we're always going to be limited by those constraints. We're always going to be limited by the boundaries of you know, Frank Gehry's office and the boundaries of the city of LA. Where what actually needs to happen, you know, is a much longer process of rematriation of the LA River and of Los Angeles. in total. So obviously it's easy for me to say without a plan for how to do that. But I think that that's always where I come to those community meetings and you know, with a lot of respect for the hard work that people do put into this. You know, I know people who have worked on this plan. I'm not trying to knock it, that there's always going to be a wall that we're hitting up against, unfortunately, within the existing structures. I would love to hear, whoever asked the question, I would love to hear your thoughts about the LA River Revitalization Plan too, either here or after the talk.
Jennifer, would you like to add something?
Yeah.
Maybe they're away from their computer.
Right, yeah, possibly. If anyone wants to voice a question, if Jennifer's not, oh, there she goes. Should I read it out loud? Sure. There are powerful forces who want to draw folk to the river, and forces who would wish it to remain rather deserted as it is today.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I think that's where the 51 miles kind of blows my mind when I think about it, and to have it's both such a strong it is a sign of, I don't know what I mean by this, but like quote unquote progress, that we're at the place of like looking at the whole river, but then at the same time it's it becomes increasingly unwieldy because of the different intersecting forces that you're describing, Jennifer. Yeah.
So issues of policing and community use comes down to whose river?
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's where my mind goes with like, but there's a limit to how we can even answer that question when the question is being posed by the same settler colonial state that annexed the land in the river in the first place.
Hmm. Thank you for that question, Jennifer. If anyone else wants to voice a question, we have time for one more. You can voice it or write it in the chat.
While we wait, I just wanted to ask a quick question. We had Niraj Bhatia speak here maybe a year ago, and your work reminds me of his. And I think you guys are in the same institution. Do you guys have any relation in terms of like how did you take his class or teach with him? Or
I have not had the great fortune of crossing paths with Niraj more directly, but I do think that Niraj, Antje Steinmuller is also at CCA, and you know, are in dialogue with a professor I did have who is Neiran Turan, and in general, I think I really appreciate the invitation. Actually, I'm originally from New York State, but and grew up there, but I've been in California for the last 5 years, and it was such a surprise to me how little I thought I would be more connected back to the East Coast institution-wise, and it wasn't until the pandemic that I felt like I was starting to see more discourse between Western architecture schools and East and Northeast, primarily architecture schools, beyond like the biggest names. And so I do think that even though I haven't worked or taught directly with him, we were kind of marinating, and I was then benefiting from being in the same place, being in the Bay Area with him. So been definitely a big fan and very appreciative.
So do you see that as a West Coast thing, kind of representation as a kind of a political means through like the imaginary, not necessarily building per se, but like I guess I'm referring to Neeraj's maps and the way that seeing the correlation between politics and in population and demographics, just kind of got a point across very quickly.
I guess, can I ask you, do you think that this is a West Coast thing?
Well, I'm not an architect, so I know less about the scene per se, but I seeing that correlation in both from CCA did make me think that maybe it was there was some shared flavors there. And it's not something that I see as often from people from the East Coast that I've seen, I guess. They have a slightly different bent.
Okay, yes. I think these are conversations that also, this one question could just be a whole other like spiraling off conversation as well. I would say, you know, on the one hand, in this case, probably not, given that Neeraj is from elsewhere, and Nehran also studied, my professor, Nehran Turan, studied in the Northeast and then previously in Turkey. And then I myself originally lived in New York and Rhode Island and Philadelphia. So I think maybe it's more less about some kind of like intrinsic thing about the places, but perhaps there is I would allow for, perhaps there's a kind of self-selection that's happening. I do think that, like, you know, me ending up at CCA this semester was a semi self-selecting, like mutual, like, you know, appreciating what's been happening at CCA, and they've appreciated what I've been up to, kind of thing. So perhaps that it would be, to me, like another influence that academic institutions have, like their draw, and how do you draw people who are working on different things, you know, to enrich the discourse at your particular institution. That would be my question.
Right. Well, thank you for such a great presentation and conversation.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for the invitation. This has been so lovely, and I appreciate seeing so many folks on the call that I know. So much love, big hugs to everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming. Good night.